Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Assistant President. Today we are faced with debating the government's election commitment dilemma, and it is a dilemma because they promised people from the LGBTQI+ community that they would do something for them, and then promised the faith groups that what they delivered for that community wouldn't infringe on the religious and faith-based practices and parental rights. The reality is that the Labor Party has promised the impossible, which is freely admitted by many of the groups that the Attorney-General's Office consulted. The proposed Conversion Practices Ban Bill 2024 legislation has actually been introduced with no demonstrable need attached. No one has been able to articulate with any clarity or point to current statistics that indicate that present-day practices are causing harm or substantial harm. Sure, there has been historical processes and practices in the past that upon a reflection, everyone would agree were not great and are not acceptable. But the question needs to be asked, without a demonstrable need or current problem to solve, is this legislation necessary? Is the legislation necessary, particularly when we clearly haven't got the balance right between these two groups? Let us be clear, this legislation seeks to regulate deeply personal matters that should perhaps remain within the domain of individual choice and autonomy. Despite the AG's attempts to insert provisions that seek to protect religious beliefs and teachings, these attempts seem to need to be clearer, leading to misinterpretation and confusion. The Attorney-General has spoken about his engagement with faith groups, but unfortunately the finished product demonstrates that either the Attorney-General failed to fully comprehend the tenets of religious beliefs, faith-based practices and teachings put to him in these consultation sessions, or he has understood them but refused to incorporate them into the bill fully. In his second read speech, the AG states, and I quote, "The bill does not impact a person's ability of their own consent to seek counsel or guidance from within their faith. Counsel and guidance can still be given provided they are not directed to change or suppress, yet suppression nor conversion practices are clearly defined. The bill premises that the range of conversion practices can't actually be defined by the Attorney-General specifically in terms of specific acts. Additionally, there is commentary that conversion practices are based on a misconception or presumption that LGBTQI+ people are broken and need fixing. Once again, no one can point to specific presently committed acts that will be covered under the definition of conversion practices that seek to do what is suggested as treating people as broken. Because of the vague concepts described in the bill, we have a bill that will limit free expression of speech between parents, family and their children, faith-based practices and, equally more important, formal, informal counselling, and actually will devalue the medical profession. The bill actually undermines the professionalism of our medical profession, particularly psychologists and counsellors. It is essentially attempting to limit their scope of practice by law based on this Parliament and the AG's medical expertise. While we acknowledge individuals who took part in the consultation process and shared their lived experiences of conversion practices in the past, basing the bill on events significantly in the past without significant demonstration of current practices that are causing concern is foolish. What constitutes a conversion practice in itself is also open to interpretation, as there have been no detailed studies in the most recent years explicitly providing the numbers, statistics, methods or forms of the conversion practices performed to base the bill on substance. The Shooters Fishers Farmers Party also notes there has been a conscious attempt by the Attorney-General to protect dangerous practices on minors, such as puberty blockers and gender reassignment medical treatments, from being considered a conversion practice. It is a particular concern to many parents within the community of the emerging evidence from other jurisdictions of harm from gender-affirming care, particularly to those that are under the age of 18. I would say to the Attorney-General and this House that when it comes to conversion practices, the barn door must swing both ways. This is one of the most polarising issues that has come up in my experience. The Shooters Fishers Farmers Party has been inundated with emails and phone calls from a variety of constituents from not only conservative points of view to other wide range of spectrums of views, including the LGBTQI+ community. This proves that that community itself is not in an agreement on this very topic, and the approach being applied. All plethora of organisations that reached out to us with very different political views have expressed a deep concern regarding this bill, coming in unison of agreement that this bill is a very problematic piece of legislation, regardless of one's belief, faith, background or lifestyle. Also, it has raised with us the very problematic reality of the consultation process, or rather lack of it, with the premeditated exclusion of certain groups that wish to express their views and be part of the bill writing process. We've been told that almost 150 organisations have been consulted, and even though this number may suggest a high volume of stakeholders consulted, the result is not reflected in reality. The Attorney-General acknowledges and states that the LGBTQI+ people do not need fixing. However, the proposed legislation creates discussions around the need for legislation to ban conversion practices, which suggests there is a problem that needs to be addressed, but yet no current events are put forward to demonstrate the evidence of that problem. The opportunity to understand this more has been taken away by not letting this bill go through the committee process, as was the intention of the Selection of Bills Committee. This bill can't be considered as balanced legislation, as it's not entirely clear how this balance is achieved, especially considering the potential conflict between banning presumed conversion practices and protecting freedom of religious belief and faith-based practices and respecting civil liberties, all based on poor consultation and unclear use of definitions. Further to the balance issue, there might be a range of views presented on this topic with polarised viewpoints on the scope and nature of this legislation, clearly indicating that many stakeholders have concerns and objections to this bill. However, it's not explicitly stated how these different views were addressed or reconciled in the drafting of the bill, as the final draft demonstrates only one side of the story. While the bill provides exclusions for certain practices, such as those conducted by registered health practitioners or attempting to limit faith-based some methods or practices, the criteria for determining what constitutes a conversion practice are broad and may lead to ambiguity. For instance, the definition of conversion practice includes actions aimed at changing or suppressing sexual orientation, but it is not entirely clear how the legislation distinguishes between harmful conversion practices and legitimate forms of therapy or expression if a person wishes or would need to access it with their full consent. The bill includes a delayed commencement period of 12 months after the assent, where the Attorney-General is citing the need for implementation, training and education of the relevant agencies and community groups as reflected from the consultation. However, it's not explicitly stated how this delay will address concerns or facilitate smoother implementation, raising questions about the necessity and effectiveness of the delay or who and what effect it would have on the stakeholders who are very concerned about what effect this bill will hold. Possibly the awareness campaign would not be necessary for different agencies and community groups if the bill was addressing a current problem that everyone was aware of. We don't know what the implementation will actually look like or what content would constitute the material distributed. Just like the consultation process, it raises more questions than answers. Instead of enacting unnecessary and unbalanced legislation, we should be focused on fostering understanding, empathy, compassion and acceptance for all individuals and their circumstances, regardless of their sexual orientation, and actually trying to come up with a fairer solution that is actually clearly well defined. Another part relates to the mental element of the offence, but does not actually turn on harm, but rather on the intention of the offender to change or suppress another person's sexual orientation, or as is listed in the bill, gender identity, with suppress once again being undefined. However, the legislation also requires evidence of physical or mental harm that either endangers life or is substantial for the offence to be proven. This creates a contradiction as the mental element focuses on intention rather than harm, while the requirement for harm suggests a focus on the consequences. There is a certain subjectivity of harm. The speech mentions that harm must either endanger the victim's life or be substantial to satisfy the offence, with substantial harm defined as more than trivial or inconsequential. However, what constitutes substantial harm is subjective and open to interpretation, which could lead to inconsistencies in enforcing the law. This is a term that has no mentioned in the Interpretation Act of 1987. According to the bill and the second reading speech, individuals under 18 cannot commit criminal offences of delivering a conversion practice, but they can be victims of such practices. This is a confused line of thinking when you consider dollying to PACs. Here in this occasion, I'd also like to mention the importance of parents' rights and choices. As parents are responsible for raising a child and their well-being and development and respecting their rights in deciding what is best for their children, and this should be paramount and represented in the bill. Consent and faith-based practices become another conflicting aspect of the bill. While the speech clarifies that consent is not relevant to proving the criminal offence, it also emphasises that the legislation does not cover the expression of religious belief if not directed to change or suppress sexual orientation. However, determining whether religious practices are intended to change or suppress identity can be complex and subjective, leading to potential conflicts between religious freedom and the law's objectives, while undermining all the work that has actually been done in past parliaments on consent and informed consent as it relates to interpersonal relationships. Further, another problematic aspect of the bill is the extraterritorial application. The legislation provides for partial extraterritorial application outside of New South Wales, meaning that as long as part of the conversion practice occurs within New South Wales, the whole practice can be considered a criminal offence. This raises practical challenges regarding jurisdiction and enforcement, especially if conversion practices conducted online, remotely or in international settings. When any possible remotely online delivered activities considered conversion practices have to be addressed and any alleged offender prosecuted. This would be extremely difficult. The maximum penalty for the principal criminal offence is 5 years imprisonment, aligning it with such offences as stalking and assault. However, some stakeholders may argue that the severity of penalties is not proportional to the harm caused by conversion practices, especially considering the potential psychological and long-term effects on victims. But since there has been no open, widespread consultation and general awareness of this bill, that is an unresolved matter. Shooters Fishers Farmers Party has listened to many different groups on this issue, including many within the LGBTQI+ community, and it is clear that this bill does not have widespread support, even amongst people within that community. I cite we have amendments to the bill that I will discuss later in the in-committee stage, including the fact around the medical transition procedures, because this bill allows for the exclusion for medical transition to whatever gender identity a person wishes to change to. And as I said in the past, or just recently in the speech, I believe this is a barn door that should swing both ways. It should not matter what sexual orientation a person changes to or from. If we are considering dangerous conversion practices, we should consider all possibilities of practices that may be dangerous and examine the evidence. So in conclusion, the Shooters Fishers Farmers Party is urging members to object to this bill that's been poorly drafted, often confused, and has vague definitions, and actually stand up for principles of freedom, freedom of religious and faith-based practices and individual rights. We should ensure that everyone has a right to live authentically and without fear of persecution or discrimination, but unfortunately this bill does not achieve that.
The Honourable Susan Carter.